The sound, that's the thing I'll never forget. Not the sight of the splintering wood, not the gasps from the small crowd kneeling on the asphalt, but the sound. A hollow, final crack that echoed through the nave of the old chapel. It was the sound of a century of prayers being silenced by a 10-pound sledgehammer. My sledgehammer. I was the one who swung it. I was the one who brought it down on the time-worn face of that wooden Christ, right there above the altar of Grace Chapel. I wanted them all to hear it. Sister Helen, with her quiet, judging eyes, the neighbors, whose hymns had become a constant, grating soundtrack to my life, and especially my daughter, Sophia, who stood off to the side, her face a mask of disbelief and pain. I did it. I, Rick Vance, a man who builds empires of steel and glass, took a hammer to their God. And I did it because I needed to prove, once and for all, that their faith was as fragile and as hollow as that splintering carving. My name is Rick Vance, I'm 62 years old, and for most of my life, I've measured the world in square footage and profit margins. I was born and raised right here, in a neighborhood that valued hard work and common sense over everything else. My father was a contractor, and I learned from him that you build things to last. You build them on solid foundations, and you don't waste time on things you can't see, touch, or sell. Religion was one of those things. It was a nice sentiment, a comfort for the weak, but it had no place in the real world. The world I operated in was a balance sheet, assets and liabilities, concrete and rebar. Life was a series of transactions, and the final one was always a loss. My wife, Sarah, she was different. She was the one who saw color where I saw blueprints. She found solace in places like Grace Chapel. I never understood it. I'd go with her on Christmas and Easter, sit in the hard wooden pew, and just wait. I'd listen to the sermons about mercy and redemption, and think about the structural integrity of the roof trusses. It wasn't for me. I didn't have any hostility towards it back then, just a profound and unshakable indifference. It was her thing, and I loved her, so I tolerated it. But tolerance curdles into something else when the person you love most in the world is lying in a hospital bed. And the only thing the people of faith can offer you is platitudes and prayers. When Sarah got sick, the prayers started. They came from Sister Helen, from the neighbors, from everyone at Grace Chapel. They held vigils, they lit candles, they promised miracles. And I watched as my brilliant, vibrant wife faded, day by excruciating day. I watched science and medicine fight a losing battle, and all the while the chorus of "We're praying for you" grew louder. They were praying for a miracle that never came. They were praying to a God who was either deaf or indifferent. The day I buried Sarah, a piece of me was buried with her. The indifference I felt towards her faith had hardened into a cold, solid block of rage. Their prayers hadn't saved her. Their faith was a lie. A beautiful, comforting, and utterly useless lie. Years passed, but the anger didn't. It became the foundation of my new life. I poured myself into my work, building bigger, taller, shinier towers that scraped the sky. And one day, an opportunity landed on my desk. A prime piece of real estate, perfect for a new luxury condo development. The only thing standing in the way was a decaying old building with a leaking roof and a dwindling congregation. Grace Chapel. Her chapel. I bought it. The community was in an uproar, of course. They pleaded. They protested. Sister Helen tried to reason with me, her gentle gaze now filled with a steely resolve I hadn't seen before. My own daughter, Sophia, begged me to reconsider. "Dad, this was Mum's sanctuary," she'd said, tears in her eyes. "You can't just tear it down." But that was exactly why I had to. I wasn't just demolishing a building, I was demolishing a monument to false hope. I was tearing down the lie that had stolen the last peaceful months from my wife and replaced them with desperate, unanswered pleas. On Demolition Day, I arrived to find them all there, kneeling on the street, singing their hymns, a last pathetic act of defiance. The crew was hesitant, unnerved by the scene. I wasn't. I shoved them aside, grabbed a sledgehammer from the truck, and walked into that dusty, silent chapel. I walked right up to the altar, looked up at that wooden face that had watched my wife pray for a life she would never have, and I swung. That story, that single, violent moment, was supposed to be the end of my war with God. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of something else entirely, something that shattered the very foundations of the world I had built for myself. If this story is already speaking to you in some way, if you feel a connection to this journey from anger to lel to what comes next, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. It helps more than you know, and I truly want to build a community here, a place for real stories. It means a lot to know where my words are landing, so if you feel comfortable, drop a comment and let me know what city or country you're watching from. Now, let me tell you what happened after the dust began to settle. The silence that followed the hammer's blow was heavier than any sound I had ever heard. It was a dead, suffocating quiet, filled with dust motes dancing in the shafts of light from the boarded-up windows. I stood there, panting, the sledgehammer hanging heavy in my hand. I looked at the splintered wood on the floor, the wreckage of a face that had offered comfort to generations, and I felt nothing. A hollow victory. The gasps from outside had faded, replaced by what I imagined was a stunned, tearful silence. I saw Sophia through the chapel doors, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a pain that cut me deeper than I would ever admit. I dropped the hammer. It clanged against the stone floor, the echo a final, metallic punctuation mark. "Get it done," I barked at the foreman, my voice hoarse. I didn't look back. I walked away from the rubble of Grace Chapel and back to the clean, predictable world of blueprints and steel. The demolition was swift. In its place, a new skeleton of iron and glass began to rise. My monument to progress. My testament to the future. I called it the Vance Pinnacle. It was my masterpiece, a tower that would dominate the skyline, a symbol of my power to erase the past and build whatever I wanted in its place. I poured every ounce of my being into it. I was on site from dawn until long after the sun had set. The clang of hammers on steel, the roar of machinery, that was my new hymn. It was a song of creation, of tangible, profitable reality. It drowned out the memory of that other sound, that hollow crack of splintering wood. But it couldn't drown out the silence from my daughter. Sophia stopped calling. Our weekly dinners became a thing of the past. When I did manage to get her on the phone, her voice was strained, distant. I had not only demolished her mother's sanctuary, I had taken a sledgehammer to the bridge that connected us. I told myself it was for the best. I was a builder, not a sentimentalist. I was building an empire for her, even if she couldn't see it. I was alone, but I was powerful. And in my world, power was the only thing that mattered. The fall came without warning. It happened on a Tuesday, on the 42nd floor of the unfinished pinnacle. I was surveying the city, my city, spread out below me like a map of my own making. One minute, I was pointing out a structural detail to the site manager, feeling the familiar surge of pride and control. The next, a white-hot poker seemed to stab through my chest. My breath vanished. The world tilted, the sprawling cityscape blurring into a meaningless smear of color. I remember the frantic shouts, the feeling of being lowered to the ground, the cold concrete against my cheek. I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that the rebar sticking out of the floor looked like a cage. And then, darkness. I woke up to the steady, rhythmic beeping of a machine. The smell wasn't of concrete and sawdust. It was antiseptic, sterile. My world had shrunk from a 42-story tower to a small, beige room. I was no longer Rick Vance, the Titan. I was a patient, a collection of symptoms on a chart, a body tethered to tubes and wires. The doctors came and went, speaking a language of cardiac enzymes and arterial blockages. They were confident, professional, but their words were just noise. For the first time in my life, I had a problem that I couldn't solve with a checkbook or a well-placed phone call. My heart, the very engine of my ambition, had betrayed me. All my strength, all my carefully constructed defenses, were useless against the enemy within my own chest. Sophia came. She sat by my bed, holding my hand, her touch hesitant. But the chasm between us was still there. We talked about small things, the weather, the nurses, the terrible hospital food. We never talked about the chapel. We never talked about her mother. We never talked about the gaping wound I had torn in our family. In her eyes, I saw not just concern, but a deep, sorrowful pity. She was looking at a fallen king, a man who had built an empire of glass and steel, but had let his own heart turn to stone. And in those long, quiet nights, when the hospital wing was silent except for the hum and beep of the machines keeping me alive, the fear came. It was a cold, creeping terror that no amount of logic or self-reliance could keep at bay. It was the fear of the void, of the final, non-negotiable end. All my life, I had believed in what I could see and touch. But now, lying in that bed, I was facing something I couldn't see, something I couldn't build or buy my way out of. I was facing the profound, terrifying silence of my own mortality. And in that silence, there was no comfort. There was no God. There was only the steady, relentless beeping of a machine, counting down the seconds of a life I suddenly realized I had utterly wasted. It's in that kind of silence that you start to hear things you've ignored your whole life. If you want to hear what I heard in that darkness, please hit that like button. And make sure you turn on notifications so you don't miss what happened next. The nights were the worst. In the daytime, there were distractions. Nurses checking vitals. The drone of the television, Sophia's strained attempts at cheerful conversation. But at night, the hospital became a tomb. The only sounds were the quiet hum of machinery and the frantic, terrified monologue inside my own head. I would lie there, staring at the acoustic tile ceiling, counting the dots, and thinking about finality. Not in the abstract, philosophical way I used to, but in a visceral, terrifying way. My body, this machine I had commanded for 62 years, was broken. My empire, the Vance pinnacle, was still rising downtown, but its builder was lying here, decaying. I was just another liability on a balance sheet, and my account was about to be closed. It was in one of those nights, adrift in a sea of morphine and despair, that it happened. I wasn't really asleep. It was more like sinking. I felt the crisp hospital sheets dissolve around me, the sterile air grow thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and wet concrete. I was no longer in a bed. I was at the bottom of a foundation pit, the one for the pinnacle. Rebar formed a cage around me, and the darkness was absolute. A physical weight pressing down on my chest, far more than the heart attack ever had. I tried to call out, but my lungs were filled with dust. This was it. This was the void I had always believed in. An eternity of cold, silent, meaningless darkness. I felt a surge of pure, animal terror, the kind that strips away every pretense of courage and control. I was a king, entombed in his own monument, a builder buried alive by his own creation. And then, a light. It wasn't a sudden flash, but a slow, gentle dawn that began in a far corner of the pit. It was a soft, impossible blue, the color of the sky just before sunrise on a clear summer morning. It didn't illuminate the pit. It seemed to dissolve the darkness, to push back the concrete and steel with a quiet, effortless authority. The light grew, and with it came a warmth that seeped into my bones, chasing away the subterranean chill. I wasn't afraid of it. In fact, every fiber of my being yearned to be closer to it. As it drew nearer, I could feel something within it, a presence. It wasn't a figure, not a person with a face and hands, but an intelligence, a consciousness. It was vast and ancient, yet profoundly, intimately personal. And in that moment, I knew. I didn't know with my mind, the part of me that calculates and analyzes. I knew it in my soul, a part of myself I hadn't even been aware existed. The presence felt feminine. It was imbued with a tenderness, a mercy so profound that it felt like the source code for every act of kindness I had ever witnessed. It reminded me of Sarah, of the way she would look at me when I came home, exhausted and angry from a bad day on a job site. The look that saw past the grime and the fury and saw the man underneath. But this was infinitely more powerful. This was the source of that love, magnified 1,000,000,000 times. It knew everything. It knew about the sledgehammer. It knew about the rage that had curdled my heart. It saw every ugly, selfish, prideful thing I had ever done. I felt the image of the splintering crucifix burn in my mind, and a wave of shame so deep it felt like a second death washed over me. I braced for condemnation, for a judgment that I knew I richly deserved, but it never came. Instead, the light simply enveloped me. The presence held me. There were no words, no celestial choir, no grand pronouncements. There was only a feeling, a transmission of pure, unmerited grace. It was a feeling that said, I see you, all of you, and you are loved anyway. The rage that had been my fuel for years, the solid block of ice around my heart where Sarah used to be, it just shattered. It broke apart and melted away in the warmth of that light. I began to weep. Not quiet, dignified tears, but great, heaving, guttural sobs that shook my entire body. I was crying for Sarah. I was crying for Sophia. I was crying for the man I could have been. I was crying because, after a lifetime of fighting, of building walls, of smashing anything that seemed weak, I had finally, utterly surrendered. And in that surrender, I found a peace I never knew was possible. I woke with a gasp. My face was wet with real tears, soaking the starched hospital pillowcase. The beeping of the heart monitor was steady, rhythmic. It no longer sounded like a countdown. It sounded like a heartbeat. My heartbeat. The first light of dawn was filtering through the window blinds, painting the beige room in soft stripes of grey and gold. Sophia was asleep in the visitor's chair, her head slumped at an uncomfortable angle. Everything was exactly as it had been, but nothing was the same. The terror was gone. The cold emptiness was filled. I looked at my daughter, sleeping there, and the chasm I had created between us didn't seem like an impossible canyon anymore. It just looked like a distance that needed to be crossed. That experience, that moment in the dark, was the beginning of everything. If you've ever had a moment that redefined your entire reality, I hope you'll stay with me for the rest of this story. Please, hit that like button, and turn on notifications. Because what happened when I left that hospital, what I found when I went back to the rubble of Grace Chapel, well, that's when the impossible became undeniable. Leaving the hospital was like being born into a world I no longer recognized. The colors were sharper, the sounds more distinct. The city I had built, My city now felt alien. I would sit in the back of my car, being driven to physical therapy or a follow-up appointment. And I'd stare out at the faces of people on the street. Before, I would have seen them as a demographic, a market, potential buyers. Now, I saw them as individuals, each carrying their own invisible worlds of hope and pain. And I wondered how many of them had ever felt a fraction of the peace I had felt in that darkness. My mind, the logical, analytical tool that had built my fortune, went into overdrive trying to explain it away. It was a textbook case of a near-death experience. A hallucination brought on by the trauma of cardiac arrest and the powerful cocktail of drugs they'd pumped into my veins. Anoxia, a lack of oxygen to the brain, could create vivid, dreamlike states. I recited these explanations to myself, like a mantra, clinging to the cold, hard facts of science and medicine. The Rick Vance I knew, the man who built things on solid ground, needed a rational explanation. He couldn't function in a world where feelings were facts and visions held more weight than blueprints. But the explanation never felt true. It was like trying to describe the sun by listing the chemical composition of its gases. It was technically correct but missed the entire point. The feeling wouldn't fade. It wasn't a memory, like recalling a dream. It was a permanent imprint on my soul. I'd be in a meeting, discussing load-bearing walls and zoning variances. And suddenly, I'd be back in that pit, bathed in that impossible blue light, feeling that overwhelming sense of being known and forgiven. The shame would hit me then, a physical blow that would steal my breath. I'd see the sledgehammer in my hand. I'd hear the crack of the wood. I'd see Sophia's face, a mirror of my own cruelty. Before, that memory had been a source of grim satisfaction, a symbol of my victory over superstition. Now, it was the single most repulsive act of my life. I had spat in the face of the very mercy that had found me in the dark. I had taken a hammer to the one thing that had brought my wife comfort, and in my arrogance, I had called it strength. How could I reconcile the man who did that with the man who had been so completely and utterly humbled in a hospital bed? The two Ricks were at war inside my head, and the battle was tearing me apart. The dreams started a few weeks later. They weren't nightmares. I would be standing in the ruins of Grace Chapel, amidst the dust and rubble, and Sarah would be there. She wouldn't speak. She would just look at me with that same expression of deep, knowing love. And then she would point toward the spot where the altar used to be, where the crucifix had hung. I'd wake up with a profound sense of urgency, my heart pounding not with fear, but with purpose. I had to go back. I fought the urge for days. What was I going to do? Sift through the rubble like a madman? What was I even looking for? But the pull was undeniable, a gravitational force drawing me back to the scene of my greatest crime. One evening, I told my driver to take me to the Pinnacle construction site. It was a lie. As we got closer, I told him to stop a block away from the old chapel grounds. I got out and walked the rest of the way, my steps feeling heavy, like a pilgrim approaching a shrine he had desecrated. It's a difficult thing to describe, this internal battle, where every logical part of you is screaming that you're being a fool, while something deeper insists you're on the right path. If you know what that feels like, if you've ever felt that pull towards something you can't explain, let me know by hitting that like button. And please, turn on the notifications, because you'll want to see where this path led. The site was fenced off, quiet in the twilight. The demolition was only partial. The foundation and some of the debris were still there, waiting to be cleared for the new tower's substructure. I found a gap in the fence and slipped through. I was trespassing on my own property. I stood there, in the cool evening air, on the ground that was once sacred to so many. My new tower loomed in the distance, a steel skeleton against the bruised purple sky, but it held no power over me. Here, my eyes were fixed on the ground. I walked slowly, deliberately, to the place where the altar had been. The place from my dreams. The ground was a mess of broken concrete, plaster dust, and splintered wood. I knelt down, my knees protesting, and ran my hand over the debris. My fingers brushed against a piece of dark aged wood, about the size of my hand. It was curved, smooth on one side, splintered on the other. I knew instantly what it was. It was a piece of the carving I had destroyed. A fragment of that wooden Christ. I picked it up. It felt warm, almost alive, in my palm. And as I held it, looking at the jagged, violent break I had made, the war inside me ended. The skeptic fell silent. I didn't have any answers. I didn't know what to call the light I had seen, or the presence I had felt. I didn't have a new creed or a set of beliefs. All I knew was that I was on my knees, in the ruins of a church I had destroyed, holding a piece of the God I had mocked. And for the first time since Sarah died, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel powerful. I felt found. I didn't take the piece of wood to a laboratory to have it carbon dated. I didn't show it to my business partners, who were already looking at me as if I'd lost my mind. I took it home, and I placed it on the nightstand next to my bed, right beside a framed picture of Sarah. For the first few days, the news of my episode was confined to the upper echelons of my company. The official story was that I was taking a leave of absence due to health reasons, an extended recovery from my heart attack. But word gets out. A 62-year-old developer who suddenly halts a billion-dollar project after being found kneeling in the rubble of the construction site. That's a story that travels fast. It started with my associates. They'd visit my home, their faces a carefully constructed mask of concern, but their eyes screamed with questions. "Rick, are you sure you're thinking clearly? The investors are getting nervous. Maybe you need more time to rest." They saw it as a breakdown, a temporary insanity brought on by grief and trauma. They tried to reason with me, using the language I understood best: numbers, projections, liabilities. My newfound, whatever it was a liability. Then came the others. The old neighbors, the ones who had knelt on the asphalt. Some were cautiously curious, others openly hostile. I'd see them at the grocery store, and they'd either avoid my gaze or stare with a mixture of pity and contempt. One man, whose family had attended Grace Chapel for 3 generations, cornered me by the dairy aisle. "Heard you had some kind of vision, Vance," he sneered. "Is that your new angle? Trying to play the saint to get us off your back?" I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain the blue light or the feeling of being held. I just looked him in the eye and said, "I don't know what it was, but it was the most real experience of my life." He just shook his head and walked away, convinced I was either a liar or a lunatic. The mockery was easier to handle than the pity. The hardest part was Sophia. She saw the change in me, but she couldn't trust it. How could she? The father she knew was a man of anger and steel. This quiet, contemplative man who spent hours just sitting, holding a splintered piece of wood. He was a stranger. "Dad," she said one afternoon, her voice gentle, "I'm glad you're calmer. But people are talking. They think the heart attack affected your mind." She was trying to protect me, to pull me back to the world of reason, the world we had always shared. But I couldn't go back. I had crossed a threshold. I started attending a small community church a few towns over, a place where no one knew Rick Vance, the titan of real estate. I'd sit in the back, just listening. The hymns I once despised now felt like a bomb. The symbols I had mocked, the cross, the candles, the quiet reverence now spoke a language my soul was just beginning to understand. I wasn't there to network or to be seen. I was there to learn how to be quiet, how to be small, how to listen. I found a strange comfort in the simple humility of it all. I finally called Sister Helen. I asked her to meet me for coffee. She agreed, her voice betraying nothing but a calm neutrality. We sat in a small cafe, and I placed the piece of the crucifix on the table between us. I told her everything. The rage, the hammer, the hospital, the blue light, the feeling of grace. I didn't ask for her opinion or her absolution. I just told her my truth. She listened without interruption, her hands wrapped around her cup, her gaze never wavering. When I finished, she simply nodded. "Mercy finds us in the strangest of places, Mr. Vance," she said softly. "Often in the ruins we make for ourselves." The turning point came a month later. The city had scheduled a town hall meeting about the future of the Grace Chapel lot. With the Pinnacle project indefinitely stalled, the property was in limbo. The whole community turned out, packing the local high school auditorium. My lawyers were there, Sophia was there, Sister Helen and her congregation were there, and the neighbors were there. I was supposed to have my legal team speak for me, to announce my intention to donate the land back to the community. But as I sat there, listening to the angry, hurt voices of the people whose sanctuary I had destroyed, I knew I couldn't hide behind lawyers. When it was my turn, I walked to the podium myself. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. I looked out at their faces, skeptical, wounded, angry. I saw Sophia, her expression fraught with anxiety. I took a deep breath. "My name is Rick Vance," I began, my voice steadier than I expected, "and I am the man who took a sledgehammer to your church. There is no excuse for what I did. I acted out of a place of profound arrogance, anger, and pain. I hated the faith you had because I felt it had failed my wife, Sarah. I thought your prayers were empty. Your hope was a lie, and I wanted to smash it to pieces to prove I was right." I paused, letting the weight of the confession settle in the room. And I was wrong. I was so wrong. In my attempt to tear down what I thought was a lie, I desecrated the memory of the person I loved most. I was a man buried alive in his own pride. It took a broken heart, literally, and a moment of grace in a hospital bed that I can't explain for me to see. It took finding myself on my knees in the rubble of my own making to finally understand. I looked directly at Sister Helen, then at the neighbors. "I am here tonight to ask for your forgiveness. Not for your approval, not for your praise, but for your forgiveness. I am not the same man who swung that hammer. That man thought strength was about demolition. I've learned that true strength is about reconstruction. It's about rebuilding what you've broken, starting with your own soul. The thing I rejected, the faith I called a weakness. It was the only thing strong enough to find me at the bottom and lift me up." The auditorium was silent. I saw tears in Sophia's eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of recognition. She was finally seeing her father again. My journey is far from over. I don't have all the answers. But I no longer build towers of steel and glass that scrape the sky. I'm now trying to help rebuild a small chapel on a quiet piece of land. It's not about changing religions. It's about a change of heart. It's about the stunning, illogical, world-altering mercy that can find a bitter old man in the darkness and show him the light. My story is proof that no foundation is too broken to be rebuilt, no heart too hard to be softened. If this story has touched a part of your own journey, if you've ever felt lost in the dark only to be found by a light you didn't believe in, please Let me know by hitting that like button and turning on your notifications for more stories like this. And I truly want to hear from you. In the comments below, share a moment when you felt a sense of mercy or grace in your own life. Your story matters, and together, we can build a community that reminds us that even in the deepest rubble, reconstruction is always possible.